This is going to be our third video on section 2.3. It's going to cover your homework assignment number 13. I'm actually going to put two videos out on this section so that you can watch either or maybe watch both. Maybe you'll get something from one that you don't from the other. The first is a review. We're going to look at a function and determine if it's linear or quadratic. In the first problem, if you'll notice, the only variable there is x to the first power, which tells me that this is a linear function. The second example I have, if you'll look at the highest power for x, I have an x squared. And if I have an x squared, this is known as a quadratic function. That's a review. In this section, they're going to give you your problems as functions. Notice f of x, and ask you to solve it. Now remember, we have the method of factoring, quadratic formula. We briefly looked at completing the square. But this is going to be your method, your choice. The first thing you're going to do is to take your problem, set the problem equal to 0. Now I'm going to spend just a few moments looking and see if I can factor. If I think I cannot factor, I'm going to the quadratic formula every time. Okay, in the first one, I do believe I can factor this. Now I'm going to just review our method for factoring one time. If you'll notice, I'm going to take the first coefficient and the last, multiply 1 times 35 is 35. I'm going to be subtracting, because of that minus, to get a negative 2. Now think of your factors of 35. I think of 7 and 5 would multiply to be 35. If I subtract 5 from 7, I get a 2. Now if I need this to be a negative 2, the 7, the larger one, needs to be negative. The positive would go with the 5. Now again, remember, trust me, I'm going to take this leading term and divide by it without the square, so I'm dividing by x. Now, because that x does not have a coefficient, there's nothing to be reduced. So I have two fractions. I'm going to feed those fractions into my parentheses here, and from bottom up. So I have x minus 7, and then I have x plus 5 equals 0. This is just a mistake on my paper. Now I'm going to set both of these parentheses equal to 0, and I have x equals positive 7 and x equals negative 5. Now remember, in my math lab, your answer would just be written with the two numbers separated by a comma. Quadratic equation, I would have two answers. In the second one, as I look at f of x equals x squared minus 14x minus 4, I'm going to first set that equal to 0. I do not know of any way that I would multiply 4 and get a 14. So I'm just going to go straight to the quadratic formula. And remember, this is where I'm going to identify my a, that would be 1, b, negative 14, c would be negative 4, and I'm going to substitute directly into the quadratic formula. Now remember, x equals the opposite of b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Now this is going to be 14 plus or minus, go back under your radical. If you square a negative, remember you're going to get a positive. Multiply a negative times a negative, you get a positive. 4 times 4 is 16 all over 2 times 1 is 2. Now let's go back to that radical again, and that'll be 14 plus or minus the square root of 196 plus 16, which is 212 over 2. Now I need to think about square root of 212 and a perfect square. I'm going to actually go to my calculator, and I know 4 is a perfect square, so when I divide 4 into 212, I get 53 even. That's what I wanted, a number that comes out even. Now the square root of 4 would be 2, so that would be 2 square root of 53, and that's going to substitute for the 212. So I have 14 plus or minus 2 square root of 53 all over 2. Now remember, we take the number in front of the plus minus, after the plus minus, and the denominator, and see if there's something that will reduce, and 2 will. So 2 divided into each of those would be 7 plus or minus square root of 53. And if you remember, my two answers will be written separately, separated by a comma. 7 plus square root of 53, 7 minus square root of 53. Okay, now those will be reviewed. That will be the method of your choice. Now in these next problems, these are what we call higher order equations. They are not quadratic, but we're going to solve them as if they were quadratic. Alright, I have x to the 4th minus 4x squared plus 3. Now let's just think a minute. These are not hard. To get an x to the 4th, I'll multiply x squared times x squared. That's my key right there. I need to multiply to get a 3, and then add to get a negative 4. Well, think. 3 times 1 is 3. And if I multiply a negative times a negative, I have a positive. And if you add 3 and 1, you've got your negative 4 there in the middle. Now take both of these parentheses, set them equal to 0. Alright, if you notice, you have a square term and a number, no x. So I'm going to use that square root property here. I'll move my constant over, take the square root of both sides, and when I do that, the right side becomes a plus or minus. And now I have square root of 3 and negative square root of 3. That's 2 of my answers. Now notice, with an x to the 4th, I need 4 answers. Now in the next one, I'll do the same thing. X squared equals 1. Take the square root of both sides. That's x equal, remember, plus or minus square root of 1. So x equals plus or minus 1. Now, remember, I need to write my answers for my math lab. So that's square root of 3, negative square root of 3, positive 1, and negative 1. There are my 4 answers. Okay, in our last example, I have x to the 4th minus 8x squared equals 9. First, we're going to set that equal to 0. Then I'm going to treat this trinomial again as usual. That would be x squared times x squared. 9 times 1 would be 9. To make that negative, I need a positive sign and a negative sign. I need the negative to end up being negative 8, so it's going to go with a larger number, negative 9, positive 1. Now set both of these equal to 0. Use the square root property, so move the 9, and in this one you're going to move the 1. This was a positive 1, so let me go back and make that a positive 1, and now when I move it, it becomes a negative. Take the square root of both sides, so that's x equals plus or minus square root of 9, or x equals plus or minus square root of 9 is 3. Alright, now on this side I have square root of x squared would be x, plus or minus, and square root of negative 1. Now remember, when you have the square root of negative 1, that's actually I. So my 4 answers are going to be 3, negative 3, positive I, and negative I.